Investigative genetic genealogy has become one of the most revolutionary tools in modern criminal investigations. It has identified unknown victims, solved decades-old cold cases, and brought answers to families who had waited generations for justice. But alongside these successes has come fear. Many people worry, is my DNA private? Can police access my DNA without my permission? Could I accidentally implicate a family member? Are we creating a genetic surveillance state? These are important questions, and they deserve honest answers. Today, we're going to separate myths from reality, discuss the ethical concerns, and explore why many of the fears surrounding investigative genetic genealogy are misunderstood. Investigative genetic genealogy is not simply a computer searching a database and announcing, "This person committed a crime." That image, popularized by television and movies, is far from reality. Instead, investigators begin with an unknown DNA sample. They create a genetic profile and compare it against databases where users have voluntarily chosen to allow law enforcement matching. Most often, the matches are distant relatives, perhaps third cousins, fourth cousins, or even more distant. Professional genetic genealogists then use traditional genealogy methods to build family trees, identify possible relationships, and narrow down candidates. A genetic lead is never the end of the investigation. It is a starting point that must be confirmed through traditional investigative work and additional DNA testing. One of the biggest misconceptions is the idea that if you take a consumer DNA test, law enforcement automatically gains access to your entire genetic profile. That is generally not how investigative genetic genealogy works. Most consumer DNA companies maintain strict policies regarding law enforcement access, and some do not permit law enforcement searching of their databases at all. The databases used for investigative genetic genealogy typically involve users who have voluntarily opted into law enforcement matching. This means the individual has made an active choice about whether their DNA can be used in this way. Understanding where your DNA is stored, who has access to it, and what permissions you have selected is one of the most important parts of being an informed DNA consumer. This fear is perhaps the most emotional. Because we share DNA with our relatives, your DNA can sometimes help investigators identify a person who has committed a serious crime. For some people, that idea feels like a betrayal, but it is worth asking a difficult question. If a close relative had committed a murder, violent assault, or left a victim unidentified for decades, should that crime remain unsolved simply because their relatives did not commit the act? Investigative genetic genealogy does not declare someone guilty. A DNA match simply points investigators toward a family line. Investigators must then collect independent evidence, confirm the biological relationship, and establish that the individual could actually be responsible. In many cases, the process also brings long-awaited answers to the families of victims who have suffered for decades without knowing the truth. This is perhaps the most complex and important concern. Unlike a fingerprint, DNA contains information not only about you, but about your biological relatives and ancestral origins. It is reasonable for society to debate how genetic information should be protected. Many genetic genealogists, scientists, and privacy advocates support strict rules governing the use of investigative genetic genealogy. Questions include what types of crimes should qualify. Who should oversee access? How long should data be retained? How should innocent relatives be protected? These are not anti-DNA questions. They are questions about responsible use of powerful technology. Popular culture often presents DNA technology as a world where authorities can instantly identify anyone, anywhere. The reality is much less dramatic. Investigative genetic genealogy requires a usable DNA sample. It requires the existence of genetic relatives in an accessible database. It requires extensive genealogical research. And even then, investigators still need independent evidence. This is not a machine that scans the population and produces a list of criminals. However, concerns about government overreach are a legitimate part of public discussion. Maintaining transparency, legal oversight, and ethical standards is essential to preserving public trust. When discussing fears, we must also remember the human beings on the other side of these investigations. There are families who spent 20, 30, or 50 years wondering who murdered their loved one. There are parents who never learned what happened to their missing child. There are unidentified victims who were buried under names like Jane Doe and John Doe. Investigative genetic genealogy has restored identities to many of these individuals. It has given families the ability to finally bury their loved ones by name and receive answers they thought they would never have. As genetic genealogists, we see DNA as a historical record written inside every person. The same technology that helps an adoptee find biological relatives can also identify a victim who has been unknown for decades. The same methods used to discover a great-grandparent can also help solve a cold case. The science itself is not good or bad. What matters is how society chooses to use it. The goal should be to balance privacy, consent, transparency, and justice. New technologies have always created fear. Photography raised concerns about privacy. Fingerprint databases raised concerns about government records. The internet transformed how much personal information we share. DNA technology is another powerful advancement that requires thoughtful conversation. Fear without understanding can prevent society from using a tool that has already brought justice and closure to thousands of people. At the same time, blind acceptance without safeguards is equally dangerous. The answer is education, transparency, informed consent, and ethical standards. Investigative genetic genealogy is one of the most fascinating developments in the history of forensic science. It sits at the intersection of technology, history, ethics, genealogy, and justice. As with any powerful tool, the conversation should not be driven by fear alone, but by knowledge and thoughtful discussion. I would love to hear your perspective. Would you allow your DNA to help identify an unknown victim or solve a violent crime? Thank you for joining me on Ancestral Spotlight. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I look forward to exploring more history, genealogy, and genetic discoveries with you in our next video.